There is a Paris beneath Paris. Hundreds of miles of catacombs from overflowing dead. Millions upon millions of bodies are stored in these catacombs, and 500,000 living people visit every year just to see them. Today, we're going to talk about how this underground shadow of a city came to be, and how it was also once used as a movie theater and a mushroom farm? Am I reading that right? Yeah? Okay, I am reading that right. Quick disclaimer, you know me, I am far from perfect at pronouncing anything, especially names. But in this particular case, we're going to have a lot of French words, names, and titles that, well, let's be honest, I'm gonna get nowhere near in terms of pronouncing right. Just bear with me, I do apologize, I won't even be attempting an accent here. So just maybe this time cut me a little bit of slack, okay? Just a little bit. I promise you can go back to making fun of me full tilt later on. Alright, let's continue. Hello everyone, welcome back to Past Pass. My name is Robin, and today I'm excited to tell you all about the Catacombs of Paris. This labyrinth of bones extends over 800 hectares, or 200 miles, underground. Sure, it may be an effective way to bury the dead, but how on earth was something this vast built in the first place? And why? Was it really just a space issue, or is there more to this? Well, we're gonna find out together, or die trying. Okay, not that dramatic, I'm sorry, it was a bad joke. Let's keep going. Les Catacombs de Paris, that's the only one you get, states that the history of the Paris catacombs begins in the late 18th century. Other sources, like the Smithsonian, confirm this and explain that by that point, enough people had lived and died in Paris that its cemeteries were overflowing and stuffed to the point that corpses were literally becoming uncovered. Those living near the oldest and largest cemetery in the Les Halles neighborhood noticed it first. The smell of decomposing flesh was so bad that perfume stores said they couldn't even do business because of the disgusting odor in the area. Louis XV, holy cow, the 15th? That is a lot of iterations of the same guy. Louis XV banned all burials inside of the capital in 1763 to try and keep things from getting any worse. But the church didn't want cemeteries disturbed or moved, so that was about all he could do. A large part of the dead had also stemmed from the Black Plague. 50,000 bodies alone were buried in 1 month during the plague. But the people during this morbid and horrific era had likely a bit more on their mind than the overcrowding issues this would cause a few hundred years later. The eventual solution was to put these bodies in underground tunnels left over from limestone quarries. The sediment itself, where these catacombs are built, actually has such a rich and extensive history that it's become an international reference for geological strata. Aside from the limestone layers, there's several meters of sediment and mud, though the Lutetian layer is the most fascinating. It's called the Lutetian layer since it refers to Lutetia, the name of Paris in Roman times, and this layer is anywhere from 40 to 48 million years old. It contains the fossilized remains of an extensive marine biodiversity. According to Les Catacombs, the Campanile giganteum is the largest gastropod ever found, which can measure up to 70 centimeters long, is one of the creatures that have been classified here. As the sea dried up, the marine fauna left behind rich fossil deposits in the limestone banks. These deposits were composed of Saurithidae and gastropods that can be seen today in the catacomb circuit. The Lutetian Bank also gave rise to the modern paleontological classification of invertebrate animals. Ain't that a mouthful? Thanks to the work of Jean-Baptiste de Monnet and Chevalier Lamarck, I hope I said that one right, who gathered a collection of over 1,000 marine fossil specimens from the Parisian basin. As cool as this layer is, it also provided an important tool for Parisians: building supplies. Lutetian limestone, also called Paris stone, supplies the major part of building stone up until the 12th century. After all these underground tunnels weren't built in a night, but over different eras and throughout the Middle Ages. Different techniques were used throughout these time periods as well, with turned pillars being put in place to support the ground, as well as a system being installed in the 15th century. A stone walling and filling plan was also developed in the late Middle Ages, as Les Catacombs describes, consisted of extracting all the stone without leaving a supporting part and then consolidating with the addition of dry stone pillars. Between said pillars, stone walls were erected to contain the backfill and make circulation easier. Though this may or may not sound good in theory, unfortunately, a lot of the digging methods used to bring up stones wasn't well regulated and was largely unmapped. This led to massive fontes, or sinkholes, to form in the upper city. In 1774, one such sinkhole engulfed pavements, houses, horses, carts, and people in a matter of seconds. It was unironically located in the Rue d'Enfer, the Street of Hell. For obvious reasons, this sinkhole became known as the Mouth of Hell, and it stretched an entire quarter of a mile long. The quarries were closed in 1776 following these collapses, but more work needed to be done. In 1777, they hired their first inspector of quarries, a brilliant architect and winner of the Prix de Rome at only age 20, Charles Axel Guillemot. And he had what just had to be one of the worst first days ever on the job. According to my source, on the very day that Guillemot took office, another collapse occurred near the convent of the, and I really do apologize for this one, Feuillon Ange Gardien, closer to the center of the city. Guillemot was on his way to the site of the first collapse, but the way was blocked by traffic and officials. His royal warrant let him through to the side of a 20-foot diameter sinkhole. Clearly, the job was going to be larger than anyone had foreseen. At that point, no one knew the full extent of the underground quarrying. Guillemot deployed cartographers to map the world below the streets of Paris. What they discovered was astounding. Some quarried areas were in layers. One generation of quarrymen had stopped work, and years later, another found the old workings and went deeper to create new ones. As Rob, author of Parisians, An Adventure of History of Paris, explains, the floor of each quarry then became the roof of yet another mine. So that now, instead of finding solid rock beneath the tunnel floor, Guillemot encountered vast cavities buttressed only by a few teetering piles of stone. Or, as Victor Hugo, author of Les Miserables, put it, Paris has another Paris under herself. Guillemot had, in my opinion, one of the worst and hardest jobs in all of Paris, to save it from collapsing in on itself. And yet, this genius architect managed it. He created the largest architectural ensemble in all of Europe, essentially making a mirror city underground, completely with streets, squares, walls, columns, just no dwellings. The map of the abandoned quarries, as one source claims, was more detailed than any map that had ever been produced on the streets of Paris. Guillemot saved Paris and, at the same time, built a shadow Paris underneath. Quite the legacy, if you ask me. Alright, now just a few years later, however, in 1780, it became obvious that something needed to be done about the bodies. I mean, that statement should go without saying, but we're saying it anyway, okay? Something must be done about the bodies, always. Spring rain caused a wall around the old cemetery in Les Halles to collapse, literally spilling rotting corpses into neighboring property. I've got to imagine that would be horrifying for anyone living next door, and it seems this was finally enough to make the church agree that these dead needed moving. Otherwise, they'd be moving themselves. Maybe not Dawn of the Dead style, but you never really want the bodies to be moving on their own though, right? In 1786, cemeteries finally began to be emptied. Cemetery of the Innocents in Les Halles was the first to close. Guillemot oversaw using the quarry voids for storage purposes. Some of the bones dated as far back as the Merovingian era, more than 1,200 years ago. So you can just imagine how many needed to be moved. Rome wasn't built in a day, and Paris's dead weren't moved in a day either. Smithsonian claims it actually took 12 years to move the 6 to 7 million dead. It was pretty expectedly a grim task, you know? In 1786, the process began of evacuating the city's cemeteries, crypts, and tombs, transferring the remains of more than 6 million corpses to the quarry region known as the Tombe Essoir, soon to become Les Catacombs. A grim, ritualized production line was established for this task, involving diggers, cleaners, stackers, divers, porters, and overseers. Every night for years, horse-drawn funerary wagons containing the bones of the disinterred dead, covered with heavy black cloths, preceded by torchbearers and followed by priests who chanted the Mass of the Dead, clopped through the streets from the cemeteries. where they disposed of their contents. Down in the tunnels, workers sorted the remains of the dead, filing them by bones into specific efficient ricks and stacks. Minor forms of folk art emerged in the disposition of these bones. Serried ranks of femurs, their gleaming lines separated by rows of skulls, all turned eye sockets outward. I bet Hot Topic wishes it could sound this edgy, huh? Guillermo's career was interrupted by the revolution when he was imprisoned, since he'd been a royal appointee. However, unlike many, he was freed and resumed his work in 1794. In 1809, the ossuary was opened to the public, and the transfers of bones from the parochial cemeteries took place from 1787 to 1814. In fact, up until 1860, new dead were buried in the catacombs, and after the revolution, people were sent down to make the bones look nicer and into heart or X-shaped patterns. Aw, that's nice. The catacombs, as some say, created an equality below ground that could never be attained above. After all, the bones are treated the same, and at least at a glance, you can't tell who's who. Past the last bones placed in the catacombs in 1860, there haven't really been any massive or noteworthy events. A bookstore boutique opened in 2017 and a new entrance was inaugurated in 2019, but by and large, that's the timeline of the catacombs themselves. However, while the catacomb timeline goes relatively quiet there, the city itself did not. In 1914, a serious cave-in took place in the streets of Paris. A 1914 edition of Popular Mechanics read that, as the result of a rainstorm that swept over the city, sections of some of the most important streets in Paris collapsed without warning. The most serious was at the junction here, where over 500 square feet of the paving heaved, then sank, killing 20 people. Gas mains broke, resulting in explosions, causing further damage to the city. Although many issues were solved back in the 18th and 19th century, the 20th still had issues with this city built on a hollow foundation. It's only natural that they'd experience these issues to some extent, given the structure. But for now, let's get back to the catacombs themselves. Of course, these aren't just catacombs. To some, they mean far more than that. A business, a vacation destination, a hideaway. Let's get into what else these catacombs have been used for, shall we? To start with, as a bit of a fun fact, quarrymen that couldn't work in the quarries anymore would rent out some of the voids as, of all things, mushroom fields. Since they were damp and dark, these areas were perfect for growing these suckers. Which, also, they can grow them from horse manure. There is literally an entire article from Atlas Obscura just talking about these mushrooms, which I find both hilarious and a pretty good break from all the talk of bodies. Apparently, King Louis himself was a fan of Rose des Prés, or pink of the field mushrooms. In the 19th century, the mushroom gardening culture moved underground when, according to one account, Paris mushrooms were grown under the site of the Eiffel Tower. Deserters of Napoleon's army hid inside the galleries below and found that their horses' manure, combined with the cavern's microclimate, spawned a veritable forest of mushrooms. This wasn't a brief fad that died out quickly either. Atlas Obscura writes, however this discovery was made, it caught on. Mushrooms had retained their royal reputation from Louis's day, and demand was high. By 1880, more than 300 mushroom farmers worked in Parisian quarries to produce 1,000 tons of Paris mushrooms each year. Most of the quarries were not accessible by foot, so farmers used wooden ladders or pulley systems to lower themselves down in baskets. Once underground, they used handheld lanterns to plant and gather mushrooms. It wasn't until 1896 that mushroom farmers eventually died out in the area because the capital's tunnels were too dangerous or too degraded. Paris had announced a plan for an underground metro system, and in response, these farmers moved to other distant quarries, and as of today, less than half a dozen or so mushroom farmers actually remain in the area. Still, this was a booming industry for decades, so I found it worth including. But hey, if you're thirsty after eating all those mushrooms, all you need to do is dig a bit until you happen across a wine cellar. And that's exactly what thieves did in 2017. In what has to be one of the strangest crimes ever heard of, these thieves reportedly stole more than €250,000 worth of wine after burrowing into a private cellar from the catacombs themselves. Like Santa, but in reverse. Police reported that over 300 bottles of vintage wine were carried out through the catacombs after they must have identified the apartment building through maps. Even though the catacombs are technically off limits at night, police have turned a blind eye to cataphiles in the past, so it's believed that could have been the case here. Cataphiles are those who sneak into and wander the catacombs at night, though we'll talk about them in a bit. This case is actually strangely similar to that of Filbert Aspert, a man that died in the catacombs in 1793 when he was likely looking for a way to break into the basement of a nearby brewery. He was eventually discovered 10 feet from an exit with a liquor bottle in his hand, and he's been entombed in the catacombs ever since as a cautionary tale. A tale that apparently these thieves didn't take too seriously. Not that stealing wine is the worst crime these catacombs have ever seen. A gruesome murder also took place in 1845. According to the Grunge, recounted this tale straight from a London journal newspaper. As the story goes, a man named Alexander Franconnard, an ill-mannered but very handsome guy, was courting a wealthy widow in Paris. The widow had a 3-year-old child with her deceased husband and had taken interest in Franconnard during her 2-year mourning period. The night her mourning finished, she and her daughter went to visit him at his work. His job? Torchbearer for people who wanted to ramble through the catacombs, which, until 1830, could be done without restriction. The widow and her daughter never re-emerged. The next day, he fled Paris. Investigators discovered the widow and her daughter in the catacombs dead. The widow had been beaten to death with a wooden plank. The child, apologies, this is actually quite terrible, had been swung by her feet so that her head smashed open against some rocks. 6 months later, he was discovered 190 miles away in a village. He was in a pub, dressed as a laborer, when a police officer asked him for a light. The officer noticed something in his pocket, a letter given to Franconnard by the widow with her name on it. He was arrested, taken back to Paris, and beheaded on March 7, 1825. Why had he kept the letter? We'll never know. Crazy people are just going to do things that we can't explain. And hey, after doing something like that, why even bother calling him a person? More people were drawn to these catacombs, some because it's fascinating, some for more sinister purposes. Between this and the dangerous, narrow, and partially flooded passages, accessing much of the catacombs has been illegal since 1955, November 2nd to be exact. Secret entrances do exist though, and it's an incredibly difficult area to police considering just how extensive these tunnels are. It's like policing an entirely other, seedy, underground Paris. Now, that's not to say that these catacombs can only be used for ill will, far from it. In the 30s, neurosurgeon Jean Tellerach painstakingly drew a map of the catacombs after he and his colleague picked the lock to a secret door in a historic building to gain access to the underground city. A few years later, in 1943, the two junior doctors gave the map to a commander in the French resistance. This guide actually gave him an idea of where the Nazi SS base was and, according to my source, enabled him to coordinate the battle for Paris from his underground headquarters. After the victory, he was awarded the War Cross, France's highest military distinction. He must have known the catacombs like the back of his hand by that point. He'd been studying them, carefully drawing them, and mapping them for years. That brings us to another group of people that feel the same way, the cataphiles, or the lovers of below, which sounds a little weird. A lot more weird than it actually is, alright? Paris's underground culture is what some, like anarchist theorist Hakim Bey, would call a temporary autonomous zone, or a place where someone can be, well, not themselves. It's said that in the 1980s, a movement was dedicated to exploring these tunnels. When a secret cinema was discovered, one of these cataphiles said that it wasn't a big deal, as there are dozens of other meeting places down in these catacombs. "You guys have no idea what's down there," he added. One source described the event as such. In 2004, a squadron of cataflics, or catacomb police officers on patrol in the quarries, broke through a false wall, entered a large, cavernous space, and blinked in disbelief. It was a movie theater! A group of cataphiles had installed stone-carved seating for 20 people, a large screen, and a projector along with at least 3 phone lines. Adjacent to the screening room were a bar, lounge, workshop, a small dining room as well. 3 days later, when the police returned to investigate, they found the equipment dismantled, the space bare except for a note, Do not try to find us. Oh god, that is a lot scarier than I'm sure they meant it to be. Though I can't agree with any vandalism and theft of skulls, these events temporarily closed the catacombs in 2009. Much of this cataphile culture seems to be devoted to exploration and gathering up information, not doing any sort of harm. The internet only boosted cataphilia, and they came up with an unofficial uniform: thigh-high waders, a small waterproof backpack, a hoodie, and a head torch. Those serious about this hobby would even carry manhole cover keys on their belts. Where do you get a manhole cover key? One early well-known cataphile may not have known about this unofficial uniform, but he was the first to photograph Paris's underground community. Nadar, inventor of a battery-operated flash lamp and used to take photographs in the darkest and most obscure places he could find, hence the catacombs. He and his magic lantern, as he called it, took hundreds of photographs, and the images were, for many, a revelation. People may have known the space existed, yes, but it's something else when you see it in black and white, not simply whispered about. This excitement for the catacombs is still alive and well today in present cataphiles that wander the tunnels. Make no mistake, it's still not legal what's being done here, and I will not promote it, especially given how dangerous it can be. But I won't pretend it doesn't fascinate me either. Just don't expect me to be giving anybody a pass on breaking the law, whether it's in this country or another one. The New Yorker writes, "A commune culture emerged with its own honor codes. The rules were few and clear. Respect the past of the catacombs. Take out what you take in. Resources are to be shared, even with strangers. No selling and no buying. Barter exchange or gifting are the only acceptable modes of transaction. Help is to be given whenever necessary. Create with care and do not destroy." Some of the cataphiles went down to party. Others, though, became fascinated by the layered histories of the space. An unofficial University of the Catacombs was established, dedicated to the restoration, preservation, and mapping of the network, and to the formal archiving of its stories. Another source, The Independent, phrases things a bit differently. They write that the 3 rules a cataphile must follow are: 1. What comes down must go up, a rule that applies to littering and is respected and enforced by said cataphiles. 2 is never speak of the above, indicating that they want to be referred to by chosen aliases. After all, when someone goes down to the catacombs, it's to escape the real world, and therefore the real world, or above world, isn't really talked about. And 3rd, they say, is never trust anyone. I suppose that last example is a little more self-explanatory though. Truthfully, people that have been visiting the place for ages seem to be responsible in how they treat it. What's more concerning though are those that are only tourists and believe they can suddenly jump into being a cataphile and do the same. Back in 2017, 2 teenagers learned this the hard way when they had to be treated for hypothermia after being alone in the catacombs for 3 hours. If you want to visit, by all means do so, just you gotta be careful about it. Similar rules for backpacking through the woods. Pack it in, pack it out. Don't trust random people, and hey, bring a jacket. Aside from these confirmed sources talking about what the catacombs are like, there are a couple of eerie legends and myths to go around as well. In one, a story goes that in the early 90s, a group of cataphiles found a video camera with footage still on it. It became apparent that the man holding the video camera was lost and had no idea how to escape. In the video, the audience can clearly draw that the man is going mad inside of this underground network of tunnels. The video ends abruptly with the man dropping his camera on the ground. To this day, no one knows who this man was or if he came out alive. Many believe that the movie As Above, So Below was inspired by this tragedy. There's also some rumors that if you go inside the catacombs after midnight, the walls begin to speak and try to persuade you to venture deeper and deeper into the catacombs until you can't find your way out. Others still say that Filbert's ghost haunts the catacombs as well, wandering like he's still lost to this day. Truthfully speaking though, I expected a lot worse and way more grisly stories, and if anything, this makes me want to visit them all the more. What do you guys think? Would you visit the catacombs? All that being said though, that is where we're going to end today's video. Thank you so much for joining me. If you even somewhat enjoyed this, consider dropping a like down below, and if you really enjoyed it, make sure to get yourself subscribed and click that bell icon. And hey, if you want to hear or see more from yours truly, make sure to check my links in the description down below. And until next time, we'll catch you later, folks.